Hello. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Eric. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah,
So this is kind of
always happy to talk early modern. Yeah.
great. So this is kind of, I suppose, a bit of an experiment. So thank you for being a guinea pig. um, as you know, I've done these understanding modernity lectures, and those are kind of traditional lecture to the extent of them being more or less, didactic. But I also was hoping to have, some interaction and so forth in general, and kind of also update my knowledge and, not make it seem like this is the end all sort of final word on it. This is just how I understand modernity at the moment, and that it would be really interesting to talk to people who understand these things even better. So that's the idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and there's so many possible conversations you could have here, right? Like, I watched the video. I thought it was a really good 15-minute summary of a whole bunch of really complicated things. So this is very Alice in Wonderland, right? Like the farther down the rabbit hole you go about sort of where modernity starts and what it is and what produces it, the more complicated it gets. So it's just sort of really depends on sort of where we want to take it together, I guess. Sort of what we want to decide constitutes modern in the first place.
Yeah. And so would you mind just sort of explaining kind of your own sort of academic background, what you research and teach and so forth?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an early modern historian, mainly of poverty, but also sort of more broadly of social relations, social and cultural history, the broad patterns of everyday life in early modern England and also sort of early modern Europe. So that takes you in a whole bunch of places you might expect, right? It takes you, I teach a second-year course on the history of colonialism. I teach a third-year course on poverty, on the history of sexuality, and on the history of plague. I teach a little bit of new history of capitalism. I teach the Renaissance, the Reformation, the witch craze, bits of the English Civil War, the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, the Great Divergence, which I guess you're covering next, and so on.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
fascinating and so broad. I mean, the idea that it's so many interesting little paths to go down, and so relevant. You mentioned the plague as well.
Yep.
I can imagine that's very significant at the moment.
It was. I mean, I did a final year class with my students last semester, which was all about the plague orders and the ways that early modern cities were locked down during outbreaks in the 17th century in particular, and they're all sitting in this like collaborate room. Actually, well, we did one with masks on in the room, and then one kind of like online, and in the one in the room, we're all just looking around like, okay, this is really weird, right? Experience of kind of studying, and I'm sure that a lot of early modernists have probably had this experience with some of their students, and then similarly with my first years, we've been sort of we discuss a bit of plague history as well, and for them, like we had a little sort of meta moment at the end of the seminar where they're like, well, I can't believe we're even talking about this. Like, if we'd been trying to talk about this in the 17th century, would we have been able to do it? And like, if we were able to have this seminar, where would it be, and so on. Yeah, really fascinating.
Well, yeah, because obviously I do history of universities, a lot of that stuff. And I came across some stuff where apparently the layout of Oxford and Cambridge colleges, especially from about 1500 on, were based off of having open air and kind of airing out. So it's amazing when we think of those things as kind of really almost decorative or kind of like unnecessary decoration, but actually in a lot of ways they were really practical. If you think about no air conditioning, no heat, but yet you need the air to flow.
Yeah.
A kind of a Renaissance courtyard is kind of ideal.
It is. Yeah. And there's I feel like someone did a little study of this recently, and there was this fascinating Twitter thread where someone who's a real expert on the history of Oxford colleges did this really interesting thread about how they sort of like eat chunks off of each other. So like colleges sort of take each other over and sort of chunk off bits of each other, and you know, bits of them would be locked down during plague time, and bits of them would be open because people lived there. And so, you know, some people would flee, but not everybody could. And so this is kind of the other thing that I often talk about with my students is like, who gets to escape from plagues, and you know, basically the inequality of kind of mobility in these moments.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, no, that's, I mean, so obviously the contemporary relevance is right there, and then so you had a chance to look at the video. I mean, there's the wider context, but I'm so fascinated by medieval, early modern, and I'm always trying to kind of pull out, well, what are the bits that are still with us, and what are the things that really changed. So I don't know if you mind. I haven't thought too detailed about the format, but what I thought we could do is sort of watch the video and then just sort of stop it when there's something I say that's really wrong or whatever.
Record scratch. Like sorry, it intervenes.
Just say stop. Yeah. Or you know, we can also just, you know, running commentary over the top of it. So this is the academic college site, and then I've just started to upload these, and there we are live. That's us talking right now. But the part 3 was the one I did on sort of early modern society. So
let's do like academics watch it back, and then I'll just sort of say like hold it right there, and we can chat about it.
Sure. So this is going now. I got my intro.
And what's cool about these is these are only 15 minutes long, right? So you're trying to summarize.
Yeah. So they're kind of like bite-sized. They're all based off of a lecture I did a few years ago in Exeter, and this was always my favorite one. So
cool. Okay. Right. Well, yeah. So yeah, we'll just kind of we could even put the captions on maybe and just see if that might be the easiest way to do it, possibly.
So there I am. I went to Chester. I don't know if you know anything about Chester.
I've been to Chester. I've been to Grosvenor Square, which is you have a shot of staring down kind of Grosvenor Avenue, I think there, which is this really kind of like old sort of late medieval, post medieval market square. I think you're walking around in one of your shots. Yeah. Yes,
I think so. So I don't know if the captions are right, but I guess discussing the way that the dynamics, because I think one of the things with traditional societies is the tension between static and dynamic, because, well, first of all, there's the issues of traditional societies themselves, but
I mean,
you could say modern versus traditional, but
so the outcome for people at the end of the video is to understand some of the basic dimensions that led to what you're describing as industrialism or industrialization, right? So, and what a lot of other historians. So pause it right here. This is a good one. So this is a good summary slide of a couple of things that are worth talking about. So this is all part of a fairly traditional and widely regarded understanding of the sort of path towards an inorganic economy or a mechanized economy, right? So. Fossil fuels factories, the cotton gin technology, these sorts of things. There's a very sort of well set pathway, from sort of basic history all the way through to advanced monographs on exactly this thing. The thing that I found interesting is most of these things are understood as gasoline on the fire of industrialism only really in the mid to late 18th century. So the free labor thing we could talk about, because that's actually true all the way through the period, as you sort of pointed out, right?
Right.
But things like increasing use of coal. I mean, there's good evidence of it being used to heat houses from well previous to the 18th century. But in terms of powering what we might describe as industrial activity, that takes much longer to get going. Factories, similarly. Most production of kind of manufactured goods is done in households, units of the household, well into the 18th century. And it's only at sort of closer to the end of the 18th century that you start to get factory level textile production or factory level bottle production or whatever. So that's interesting as well. And similarly, with technology, a lot of historians of sort of economic activity tend to focus on particular or they used to focus on particular technologies. So the cotton gin or the steam pump for mining or something like that. But what's interesting about that is that if we sort of let go of industrialism and we just start talking about technologies that really change everything, it isn't things like that did all the work. It's ocean-going tech. So it's navigation or a better ship or a more seaworthy vessel. These sorts of things have made huge changes by the time we get to the 18th century.
Right.
In commerce, in trade, and so on.
Sure.
That are externalized to the kind of traditional society you're describing, but which affected enormously. Because
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, because I suppose it sounds like to a certain extent I've gotten some of the timing right in terms of fossil fuels and factories being towards 18th into 19th and so on. Mm-hmm. But then the technology, I suppose, I think my conception comes from someone like Lewis Mumford, who talks about the kind of eotechnic versus I forget what it's like, the paleotechnic and so on. And it's kind of this idea that some of the technologies are around, mm-hmm. but what really comes together in what he calls the paleotechnic or industrial era is that these all start to work together as like this complex system. But I can see what you're saying about the navigation sort of at least 100 or 200 years prior, because those are really complicated endeavors, the ships, and they require all, not just, physical technologies, but social technologies of time and all sorts.
Oh yeah. I mean, if I was looking for like a narrative of technological progress, me personally, that sort of defined technical change over time in the early modern period, I wouldn't choose the cotton gin. I would choose sort of the East Indiaman vessel. I'd choose a ship.
Right.
And then, it's not as flashy, right, in terms of sort of the visual nature of the change. We don't get the Satanic Mills iconography. Sure. But if you just think about the sheer volume of people and things that are carried and the sheer sort of volume of change that is produced by that activity, it's enormous. It's one of the reasons why a lot of the economic histories of the 17th and 18th century are really focused on what historians describe as the consumer society, the sort of so-called first consumer society. And it's very difficult to have one of those if you don't have a whole bunch of different things to consume. And so, it's a big historiography of luxury and trade goods and the Columbian Exchange, which I think you mentioned in the talk.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think it's coming up in one of the lectures I have planned to discuss the kind of debate over the consumer revolution and sort of how that had to be brought back into the story of the Industrial Revolution, because it was kind of like the first telling of this sort of left out, well, who was buying all of these goods that were being produced? And from your telling, you add in the extra layer of overseas trade, and the consumer revolution might even have been prior to the industrial.
Oh, it was prior. Yeah, broadly speaking. And prior to industrialism as well was the industrious revolution, which is a phrase from Jan de Vries, which is the notion that people's economic behavior, but also people's laboring behavior, which you touch on, with the idea of free labor and labor mobility, which is a really important part of the story, that is changing in advance of the technology as well, which is something we'll go on to. But anyway, that was a long pause. So.
No, that was perfect. So let's see what I had to say after that. So explore how traditional society was different, but then led to. So that's, I suppose, what I was saying about how a lot of times these are treated as really static societies, but it actually took quite a lot of work and effort to not change in certain ways. And I suppose part of the story I was trying to suggest was that the economy and the changes of labor and production and I suppose consumption are really what pushes that kind of concerted stability. It disrupts it and sort of makes it where change becomes the default.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two schools of thought on that. I mean, I'm no medieval economic historian, so I can't comment on the sort of dynamism or lack thereof of medieval economics, but I would guess it's actually probably more dynamic than people assume. It's just that we don't see any of the more obvious transformations that we're expecting to see, if you see what I mean. So we're looking for, I mean, you have a very good diagram later in the video of the sort of 3-field versus 4-field shift in agricultural production. And that's a really good classic example of kind of a sort of new technical way of doing things coming in and really shifting things. But I suspect there's going to be a range of those available to study in the medieval period as well. It's just they haven't echoed down to us in the historiography quite as reliably.
Right, I see. Well, and this is the other bit I wanted to communicate, which was that modernity itself, and I later I get into scientific modernity and the way science categorizes people, Foucauldian order of things type of stuff. And I didn't want to say that these traditional societies were backward in any type of way, but it was just, I'm genuinely trying to just express a chronology of there was difference before and after, even if this was a long process. But so I don't know how common that is.
I mean, it's sort of the necessity of periodization, right? Because once we start to sort of ask ourselves, what is the difference between medieval and early modern? It starts to get very arbitrary. Where do you start early modernity? Do you start at the moment Gutenberg invented the printing press? Why? Because he didn't really invent it, right? Like, do you start it when the Reformation starts? Why? Like, it just becomes a question of priorities. And similar with modernity, which we sort of typically start in this telling with sort of the late 18th century, with the Age of Revolutions, maybe, with sort of the American, French, Haitian, a range of revolutions in that period. A lot of people started there. But then, what's to separate that start from, the scientific revolution? Why aren't we starting in the early 17th century?
Yeah. And
so it just becomes a question of what you're looking at and what criteria you're using to measure the idea of modernity by, right? If being modern is about everybody knowing more or producing more or doing more or living longer, each of those things is a different chronology. And you would have to start modernity in a different place based on your information.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Great point. Let's see what Here I tried to blend the caveman into my.
I love this guy. It's like something out of a Halloween calendar.
There he is. Oh, there he is. I don't have quite the same beard. But yeah. So I just didn't want to reproduce the idea that not modern people are somehow backward. But yeah, I suppose I did. This is different, that type of a society on this image. I don't.
Yeah, it is different. I mean, we can describe it as traditional. We can describe it as medieval. We can describe it as whatever we want. I think most historians tend not to use traditional society anymore. Not that, although these are societies heavily informed and indeed governed by traditions. It isn't sort of, we tend to use other distinctions, but that's just mainly because it's sort of a term of art, for us. So early modern.
I think it's kind of a sociology thing, because we do traditional to like there's that kind of Ferdinand Tony's Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. There's so many of this kind of traditional to modern, but I do think that's kind of sociology more than history, isn't it?
Yeah, and some of it might be coming back. So I mentioned the new history of capitalism. They're very interested. Those historians are all very interested in the transition to capitalism and reinterrogating what that even is and looks like, and so on. So transition is definitely a word that we use a lot. And it's just kind of whether it's a transition from tradition or not, because ultimately a lot of the traditions that we think of as characterizing this period both quite accurately characterize the period before it and actually quite accurately characterize the period after it. A lot of the things that we conceive of as sort of very modern, they don't come until the mid to late 19th century sometimes, or even the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially something like when I'm going to talk about democracy. I mean, suffrage doesn't really hit until well into the 20th century in a lot of places.
I mean, it's considered very radical when in the 1690s in England, the franchise is like 1 in 7 adult males. And
Right.
members of parliament are like, whoa, 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 that's way too many people voting, right?
Yeah.
And, there's a bunch of formal property qualifications and so on to actually cast a vote. And, but that actual period, that whole period is called the Rage of Parliament because there's just so many elections held and so many, sort of political contestations back and forth with 1 in 7 of the adult male population voting.
Yeah, gosh. Well, that sounds intense.
It was.
I suppose because this when I went to Chester and so on, I was thinking of the economic side of things, but obviously the economy in context. But you mentioned that you aren't an economist, but I do think of your research as being linked to the labor and the ways that some of these almost like inclusions and exclusions, like so much of what I'm thinking is like the way towns and cities managed kind of membership, and so much of that seemed to be how the economy was managed, that eventually all of these, like the first category here, the landowners and peasants, that's a kind of class, that's classic, Marxist sort of feudalism. The essence of feudalism is that, and then it changes to proletariat and capital. But to my mind, the medieval economy and society is also, much more embedded in things like the church and guilds and so forth. So
it is, and it remains to a certain extent very much the case all the way into the 16th century. One of the things that's happening here is that like it's early modernity can be a hard thing to defend as a notion of a separate time period. But like as an early modernist, I'm always like, are we talking about the medieval period, which I conceive of as having ended? Certainly by sort of the 16th century, I would sort of conceive of medieval as sort of, I wouldn't use the word anymore. Or are we talking about early modern? Because it is sort of separate as a specialization.
Sure.
And by the 16th century, we don't. Certainly, English historians tend to use the word peasant a lot less now. By that century,
what are they using instead? Like tenant farmers, or?
Yeah, I mean, mainly because we're now increasingly using the language of sorts in the 16th century in England in particular. So the lower sorts, the middling sorts, and the upper sort, or the upper classes. But there are many different ways that you can sort of divide, where you can describe the social order, and contemporaries did all the time. So there's a really famous homily, a religious sermon that's printed in the 16th century called the Homily on Obedience, and it has this extensive kind of list of occupations and sort of stratified roles in society, and it says, okay, you got to stay, you got to stay in those roles, and that's new and different for historians than the kind of traditional medieval threefold distinction, which is those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, right? Which is the kind of classic sort of theological separation. But I mean, landowners and peasants works too, like basically haves and have-nots, rich and poor.
And I guess at some point, well, maybe I can, if I press play, I'll get into the next bit where, to my mind, it so much had to do with the ownership of the land and sort of property. So you've got the landlords and the landowners, who would be distinct from those who rented the land. And in a lot of ways, I'm sort of separating out people inside towns and cities as having their own separate. So this is very much kind of like countryside,
rural. Yeah.
There's the owners, and then there's the tenants, and in places like Britain, there's the complication of the gentry. But that was kind of what I was thinking there.
Yeah, and I mean, in England, in particular, for instance, about 10% of the population, so sort of the gentry, broadly speaking, owned about 40 to 45% of the land. So it's a pretty, it's a good way of looking at things, basically.
The gentry, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one, and the crown and the church, until the dissolution of the monasteries, in the church's case, are by far the biggest landowners, as you noted.
Right.
And yeah, it's just a question of sort of, again, just sort of change over time. Like the crown steadily becomes less and less and less of a major landowner, over the period, because in order to finance crown debts, they just kind of keep selling off land to their creditors, or they keep donating, you know, they keep giving away property slowly but surely as time goes on. And similarly with the church, there's the rupture of monastic dissolution, right? So in the 1530s, Henry VIII, right, quite iconically is like, nope, give me that, and just kind of like acquires, you know, a really significant tranche of land, which he then immediately turns around and gives to all of his supporters, or they buy it from him, or whatever. There's this real
well, and there's the idea that he funds education, or at least he was supposed to. But
yeah, well, some of those priories are converted actually into sort of elite schools, but most of it is about kind of basically buying political power.
I suppose I was thinking of like Trinity College, Cambridge is funded from the lands donated at that time, and that's and Trinity funds about 70% of the budget of the university. So
yeah,
you know, that kind of donation is still doing a lot of work from back then.
Yeah, if anyone's wondering why Oxford and Cambridge have a head start. Yeah.
Okay. So and I think I found this particular image that's up there is there's all these different, you know, tasks and jobs, and there's the shepherd, I suppose, cleaning the wool. There's the person collecting thatch. I suppose each of these probably corresponds to a surname at this point. There's the
in the medieval
weaver
period, and Thatcher. Yeah. I mean, I think there's less and less of the kind of surname is your occupation by the time we get into the 16th and 17th centuries. Certainly, there's much less of it by the time we're starting to talk about kind of proto-industrialization. But a lot of people's surnames would, you know, perhaps originally have come from this sort of occupational division. That in the deep past that their ancestors would have partaken in. The part I think is interesting about this is that we typically describe this, as this is rolling, we describe this as a very sort of asymmetrical one-way relationship, don't we? Like the landlords owned and the peasants worked, right? And did the renting and did the working. And that's, as a generalization, totally correct. But in the nuances of this, there's so much sort of defense by the lower sorts of various common rights, access, traditions, perquisites, carve-outs, low levels of annual rent. There's all this negotiation in the actual system,
right?
Which, you know, we have to gloss over when you know,
when you tell the broad story.
Yeah. But that negotiation and how that negotiation eventually sort of slowly fades out, because it does. Slowly fade out. That's a change over time story that's really interesting. Basically, if I was characterizing it, I would say if you're a peasant in the 16th century, you're much more likely to be able to successfully defend your economic interests using riots, protests, petitioning, various means, than if you're a peasant, than if you're a poor worker in the 18th century. Right? By the 18th century, the law is very much on the side of your landlord, and all the practices and all the assumptions are very much on your landlord's side as well. The community is less willing perhaps to rise to your defense. You probably have less rights to defend by that 18th century. So that process of dispossession is a big part of how this landless laboring class that Marx describes as the proletariat comes into existence. And that dispossession is gradual. People often think of it as like, oh, it was just everybody was kicked off the land. No. That takes a couple hundred years, to happen, basically.
Yeah, and presumably not very many of the folks caught up in this were aware of the long. I mean, it's still not something that we know about today, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're in the middle of this, you're defending your local rights, you're defending your local community and the way things have always been in and around you, right, in and around your life. You might be thinking into the future of like, what if this happens again in my community? And you might even have larger pretensions to kind of the stability of the realm, you know. And you see this with Kett's Rebellion and even in the Pilgrimage of Grace and in these other very large popular rebellions in the 16th century. You see it in the Oxfordshire Rising in the early 17th century.
Right.
Yeah, the big difference, I guess, is just is that, as you say, that sort of future sight isn't there, right? Like, how could it be?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there's something you mentioned there that I was really struck by, but I might have lost it. um, so let's see where did we go to next? Oh, I remember now. Sorry, I just remembered the political. So this is an economic issue, but it's actually a political dispossession of rights. And I was wondering if you came across Martin Prock and the Citizens Without Nations. It's a really interesting kind of retelling of citizens' rights from the basis that municipal rights were far stronger, and actually the French Revolution is essentially stripping all of these rights that Europeans used to have locally. And that's something that I came across when I studied like the French Empire taking over Germany, especially during Napoleon, really removed all of these local particular practices and rights and negotiations, and just replaced them all with this really rational kind of Code Napoleon type of system. And then that leaves the room to have kind of distant bureaucrats become responsible for places that they don't know anything about.
Yeah.
And that to me is very much like that's almost modernity.
Oh yeah, sure.
Like to each court is that kind of like distant powers type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read this book, but it looks really good. But it reminds me of Seeing Like a State by James Scott, which says something sort of similar about cameralism and about which you mentioned, I think, and about the sort of the state. Very state-intensive projects of sort of rationalization and mass cultivation, and these forests in Germany that just like look the exact same, right? Lines of trees, and yeah, I mean, I think if there are many debates over where you should start modernity, but I would agree, I would start it there. Right? Never mind the tech, right? Like the tech just follows. It's about the state. It's about politics and rights and the organization of people in new ways, so that the state can better mobilize them in the Napoleonic case, or control them, or educate them, or turn them into
extract value from them.
Yeah. That's, I mean, if we want to sort of characterize what modern means, that it appears to be that.
So let's see what happens next. I haven't watched this for a little while, so it's useful for me as well. Right. Okay. So I explain a bit about just and you're suggesting that's much closer to a medieval system that gradually changes.
We have a very mixed economy.
The kind of putting out, or not the putting out, but the kind of working the fields and so on certain days, and
working your Lord's field, on the Saturday or whatever. That I think that's broadly. I mean, you might hire out to do something quite similar in the early modern period, but it would be wage based. It might be you might be paid in credit or arrears. I mean, a lot of this economy is not what we would call specie based. It's not hard currency based. It's based on credit. So you'd have a line of credit with your landlord or your local victualler or whatever.
So mediated by certain exchange by that point.
Yeah, and so it's it's what Craig Muldrew calls an economy of obligation. So it's tit for tat. It's very much based on place and reputation and reliability. And so not a whole lot of hard money has to change hands in that sort of scenario, as long as there's an agreed value, which there generally is. You can do a lot of economic activity without any coins changing hands at all.
Sure. So there might be some register, even an informal, keeping track in some's head based off of a handshake or whatever.
Oh yeah, and like millions of pages of account books. just so many account books.
So this bit here, I start to get into. This is something I'm pulling from Norbert Elias, where the monarchs are essentially the largest landowner, and what they do, across the end of the medieval into the early modern, heading towards absolutism, is really dramatically increase these standing armies. And that seems to be one of the processes of centralizing and consolidating these large nation states as opposed to these smaller states. I suppose Westphalia and onward is kind of a story of that of that type, I suppose. But
Increasingly, I mean, certainly, again, it's so dependent on who you're talking about, because for the British, they are primarily hiring other people to do their dirty work well into the 18th century. And they're using national debt to do it, right? So like to fight France in the early 18th century, they basically create the national debt to hire a bunch of German mercenaries to go fight the French. Like, they're doing some fighting of their own, and there's quite a lot of sort of naval conflict that comes into that. But in terms of who might be raised to fight in England, there's actually widespread opposition to the idea of a standing army in England for quite a long time, because it's understood as an instrument of tyranny. It was associated, so James was sort of trying to build up, James II tried to build up quite a success, actually did succeed in building up a pretty reasonable standing force. But in the run up to the Glorious Revolution, that is increasingly seen as a means by which James could tyrannize and exert undue absolutist control over the realm. And it's part of the panic, which eventually provokes his essentially his political defenestration, right? He's run out of the country by the nobility of the realm. They're like, whoa, we don't want you. You're Catholic, and also you've got a huge army. And so the solution to that is sort of ironically to kind of hire, well, not really hire, but invite William of Orange, right, to come in with his army.
And then they have such a sort of regimented army because of the, century or more by this point of conflict with the Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, most of the conflict with the Spanish is conducted nautically, so there aren't that many kind of land-based. There's bits of the 30 Years' War where the English intervene, in particular. So but almost never all that successfully. Like they get involved during James I's reign, and like it just goes terribly.
So much. I guess you're right. Is nautical, at least from England. I think I was thinking of Maurice of Orange. I think I read he recovered like Julius Caesar's notebooks. And again, this is kind of one of those things of what's a technology or because it's not necessarily adding new gunpowder or what have you, although the invention of rifling and so on is very significant but I think the bigger issue was that they learned how to drill.
Yeah. So
he recovered the classical tradition of drilling so that you could have these cores moving. But then I would guess that it was these Germans that did the Hessians or the Swiss guards and so on that you would hire as mercenaries. But that's also interesting because I think the thing I was trying to point out was that these monarchs consolidating their states caused the introduction of currency. But actually that could happen not necessarily from paying soldiers, but from introducing the national debt, which then becomes traded around, I guess.
Yeah, and the currency is created and recreated multiple times in this period. So there's sort of no single currency. There's the coin of the realm, which is meant to have this kind of official status, which you're not meant to counterfeit, and so on. And that's all about monarchical authority, and it's all about the legitimacy of sort of the rules of the realm. But that gets, like, they have to keep redoing it because it keeps getting devalued and the coinage keeps getting kind of like sort of rarer and less valuable. And for a long time, in the 16th century, for instance, during a period of very nasty inflation in the middle of the century, it's a lot better to pay for things using Spanish currency than it is English. And so it really depends on like.
Because I guess with Spanish backed by gold from South America.
By silver primarily, and then sort of that's sort of minted through Italian banks to produce, the piece of eight and so on. But I mean that all of that, which is all very quite important, and you get onto mercantilism later and bullion and the balance of trade and stuff. All of that actually kind of comes after. It's a sort of product of the needs of the state, in a way that is very interesting. So
that's interesting. Yeah. So then I guess here, I suppose I'm trying to build up to where this factory form comes from. So that was just something I knew about the church bells, and because obviously China will have invented gunpowder, but they used it for fireworks and things, not necessarily for. I think they also used it potentially to light natural gas. They sort of used fossil fuels for heating or even just lighting. Anyway, the Europeans used these things to fight one another, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and not exclusively either. I mean, guns are. I don't. I mean, I'm no military historian, but my understanding is guns aren't a particularly European invention. I don't think so. I mean, I think like there are various things that end up getting called a gun, and then there are particular types of guns, like the musket, which are sort of distinctly European. But again, this is way out of my league. Kind of people fighting each other is very much less the history that I do, as it were.
I suppose there's Ottoman janissaries and so on. So like, there's nothing particularly European about that.
Well, no, and I think what's interesting here is there's nothing particularly European in this period about military supremacy either. So right to the end of the 18th century, a lot of the strongest kind of military powers in the world, they're not really European. The Spanish are, but the Spanish are because of the essential asymmetries of Atlantic colonialism. They kind of luck out, right? In the sense that they, disease plus a range of other circumstances, which we can go into, give them a truly astonishing kind of imperial hinterland by kind of the mid 16th century, and they dine out on that for 100 plus years.
Right.
So it's if you were kind of thinking about the main threats of the 16th century in terms of Europe wide, it's not the Spanish, it's the Ottomans. The Ottomans are by far the most powerful kind of military power, in and near Europe.
Well, by 17th century, aren't they? They essentially are siege Vienna and almost win there.
They take Vienna, in that period. So do they take it or do they fail? I can't remember.
I think they almost take it, and then there's someone from Poland. I think you saved them.
Adolphus, probably.
Yeah, there's someone from Poland that comes and saves the day.
They're trying to conquer Vienna as late as 1683. It tells me here. So this is clearly an abiding issue.
Yeah, and well, I suppose what's interesting about both of those examples, and this is getting off topic a bit, but it's interesting. Spain and Ottoman are actually probably the most imperial at this stage, in the sense of, from what I understand, and I don't know as much about Ottoman Empire, but I think that the sultans, like, sort of the expectation was each generation had to expand the territory. That was like kind of their mission, was the sort of one sovereign would reign, and then the next sultan would have to push it farther, and then so that's a clear imperial dynamic. Whereas some of the European states, especially things like the Habsburgs, might consolidate, but a lot of times prefer matrimony and sort of court arrangements and legal transfer. Like, it wasn't necessarily imperial until much later, actually, for some of the European countries.
Yeah, I mean, again, it just depends on what we're defining as imperial here. I mean, the Spanish Reconquista in the 15th century is explicitly imperial, sort of reconquering the Iberian Peninsula from kind of the various Moorish kingdoms that are there and so on, which was, all of them were themselves a sort of product of earlier Ottoman expansion and earlier Caliphate expansion in the medieval period. So yeah, I mean, it's just as always, right? The historian's answer, it just depends on where you look. But
you can always dig in further, and I think that's kind of actually the point of why I wanted to just experiment with this series, because there's the sociology big grand narratives, and I think it's difficult to communicate them without making these big broad sweeping statements, but there's the historicist kind of like the exceptions and the kind of varieties of capitalism or whatever it is, and I
mean, I'm a lumper as well. Like, I've been told this. I'm a shameless lumper. So in history, there's lumpers and splitters, right? So
is that right? Okay.
Well, I mean, call each other. Sort of this notion that there are people who are deeply interested in the particularities and what we can kind of learn from particularities. Sure. There are people apparently more like me who are interested in what historians would describe as grand narratives. But I mean, I think there's a lot of value in grand narratives backed up by particularities. So the civilizing
You
process.
can't do one without the other. I suppose
No.
this bit here, because I don't want to take up all of your time, but I did go through this bit. I'm really fascinated by guilds.
Yeah.
And by the church.
Yeah.
And is this the bit you mentioned earlier?
This is Chester, is it not?
Yeah, so this is Chester, and just the way that the guilds managed these cities, and the way the church was involved in them as well. I don't know. It's just something that I feel like modernity strips away all of those really complicated relations.
It does, and in varying stages too. So again, just taking the English context, which is the one I know best, Anglicanism as a religion, in effect, just the creation of it in the early 16th century radically changes the relationship between kind of church and society. It had to, right? Kind of hives off the English church and makes of it a kind of an arm of the states in many ways, right? By making the monarch the head of the church. And similarly, the guilds too have a kind of golden age after which it becomes increasingly less relevant that you're a member of a guild. It's still quite important in sort of social and ceremonial senses, but maybe in terms of the intense regulation of economic activity, the guild starts to give way to the limited monopoly company. So the Virginia Company, the Merchant Adventurers Company, the South Sea Company, the Royal Africa Company, and so on. So those companies and the sort of charters they get from the monarch, which are akin to some of the charters that monarchs used to give to guilds, those start to become the kind of the passport to particular types of economic activity, and many of those are outward facing. So guilds are in many ways incredibly inward facing corporate organizations, whereas all these merchant companies are very much like, we want to trade with Russia, we want to trade with China, we want to trade with India, and so on.
Right, and I suppose, but then they must have these kind of conflicts that are they must play themselves out in terms of access to city markets, places like London, or whatever. But that they are these kind of global tensions almost, and the tension between the global and local, but they'd have to get resolved in like who has access to the London markets, and then by extension, all of the markets that are linked to the London market. So then up to the Midlands or whatever. And then that must then contribute to the kind of really rapid emergence of these new centers like Liverpool, Manchester, that are kind of must be outside of what's regulated. They're sort of like just on the periphery of what the guilds and church can regulate, and then those actually become the new centers, I would think. Yeah,
well, they become, so Liverpool and Bristol, so Bristol first and Liverpool second. A lot of their growth is driven by the slave trade and the coal trade and a couple of other things, but and trade in general. But certainly for Bristol's first huge kind of economic boom in the sort of late 17th, early 18th century is very, very slave trade driven. And it becomes sort of the first major slaving port in the country in that respect. And Liverpool follows suit in the sort of mid to late 18th century, and actually Glasgow after that as well is sort of briefly involved in the trade as well. So these guilds. The thing I would emphasize here, and again, it's difficult to be a historian of all these things, but the one thing I do know about these guilds is they become like they retain their social and cultural importance long past when they might be economically powerhouses, if you see what I mean. So it's still very important to be a member of the Mercer's Company or the Draper's Company or whatever into the 17th century. Okay. Even if it doesn't give you exclusive. Well,
because maybe it does give the access to the local government or the local social order and
all those things, and contacts and networks. Just think of them as like really long-running academic conferences. They have dedicated poor relief, and they have dedicated charitable outgrowths. They maintain headquarters and buildings. They run private apprenticeships programs and stuff as well. So guilds are, I think, very well explained by the kind of who you know complex, right? In addition to all their other more formal functions.
Yeah.
I loved
I
this.
hope
By
you
the
don't
way.
mind. I'm just going to let it run so that we time out correctly, because
Yeah,
we could
I
we could
loved
probably
this.
go into this all day if we.
Yeah,
And one of the things I had in mind was reproducing kind of, you know, the pub chats of just getting really into the nitty gritty details and
I
stuff.
miss
So,
pub chats.
well, here's my 4 fields.
I want my pub chats back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in lieu of that, but yeah, so I mean, these are pretty big generalizations as well, but
I mean, I thought this was very good. I thought this is the kind of thing I would love to see more of, actually. You know, I would use this video with my students to try and get them interested in the history of agriculture. Yeah, I mean, the thing about this, which is interesting, is you mentioned clover and the kind of role of clover in four-field agriculture.
yeah,
And one of the guys who's very precocious in terms of clover's benefits in England, in English agriculture, is a guy he's an engineer by the name of Andrew Yarrington, and he's obsessed with clover. He loves clover, and he's all over this in the late 60s, sort of 1670s, 1680s. And he's actually that's actually fairly early for this kind of thing. It takes a couple decades for four-field cloverfield agriculture to really take hold.
right. Yeah, well, because I mean, I guess to me, there's so much science that kind of comes out of that kind of economic interests that agricultural landowners, but also, you know, you can imagine there must be so many different elements of the craft that different tenant farmers would have had that would start to kind of percolate up as the fields were being consolidated as well. That kind of like the way certain intellectual property gets claimed from, you know, Africans later in the 19th century, when there's kind of the scientists go in and extract the folk knowledge and so on.
And it turns out to be quite wise. And there's a similar process at work with farming in England domestically. So a lot of the kind of practices that Yarrington is commenting on, he's sort of been talking to farmers who are doing it. And so he's getting that kind of almanac experience from them, in effect. And actually almanacs are really popular, printed documents in the 17th century, farmers' almanacs, and they contain a bunch of advice about how to farm better, how to farm well.
And there must be such an interesting kind of sort of the way knowledge gets organized into almanacs versus in encyclopedias, for example.
Sure, encyclopedias come sort of much later and are organized for very different purposes, sort of universal classifications, right, of information, as opposed to very targeted. The one thing to say here, while this is running and kind of we're talking about farming, is in England this all starts to come under the heading of something called improvement. So the improvement of agriculture, but the improvement of a bunch of things, and improvement is actually a forerunner of what we would describe as political economy. So the notion of better organizing entire societies with respect to sort of their economic outputs and their economic efficiencies, and all of that is in many ways a story of the 17th century and the 18th century, but it really gets going in the later 17th.
And so, I mean, I sort of, as a shorthand, credited a lot of this to these particular camera lists and so on, really working from a central position. But I suppose it must have overlapped with different church folks and merchants and you know, it's not just these kind of scientific advisors, but there's this kind of interest across that particular strata of society, I guess, that are almost like
they're all
knowledge
related.
workers or something.
Yeah, they're all related to each other anyway, and they all know each other, and they all go to the same dinner parties. You know, so it's not just the Royal Society getting involved in this, or the academy that Louis XIV sets up. Academy, I think it's just called the Academy. You know, I mean, his chief boy Richelieu is a huge improver in late 17th century France. He's obsessed with it. And it's all about national strength. It leads on to this notion of kind of the balance of power, both economic and military, and how connected those things are. Statesmen, this is the art of statesmen in this period, is sort of knowing how to better do all these things. And, you know, they're pulling various levers. The excise office, for instance, is created in the early 18th century in England to kind of better calibrate colonial taxation in a way that improves the sort of the strength of the realm in kind of more more rational ways.
Yeah, well, and I suppose that's fascinating to me is the relationship between the consolidated consolidation of the internal states as well as the colonials, because there's the kind of distinction between the domestic state and then the colony, and the kind of inside and outside, and yet there's like a kind of intensive process of drawing in all of the parts of what's considered the internal territory.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also this kind of consolidating or wanting to acquire as much colonial territory, I guess, resources and so on.
Yeah, just access. I mean, I mean, growth is difficult to understand in this period. There's not really much consistent economic growth across the period. Like average growth rate per country per year is like 0.4, 0.3%. Like it's really low, right?
Right.
But once you get down underneath that, and those are just, that's sort of like GDP extrapolated.
Yeah, that's like economic historian type of.
Yeah. But once you get underneath that, the arenas of the economy that are growing, as it were, a lot of them are heavily informed by the colonial context. Okay. So it might be the sugar trade, huge, right? Huge trade in this period. The slave trade, the fur trade for the French, raw resources, timber, fish, these sorts of things, which are, you can procure them in mass quantities from North America in this period. Chocolate, coffee, luxury goods, right? Which, if you're a merchant and you're looking to do a really profitable single ship run, you want to have at least one of those luxury goods in your trade route, because the profit value on the way back is like 200%.
Yeah, things like spices, because it's like you can, they're really small but valuable.
Exactly, you can pack them in, and you can really kind of, there's economies of scale in that, which these folks are increasingly recognizing the utility of. Yeah.
Right. Well, as I said, we could probably go on all day with this, but I'm so grateful to you for just going through it. It sounds like I didn't miss the mark too bad, but as we discussed, you could always go into the details, and I find them fascinating personally.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the balance, right? Just winding it off there is like, there's nothing wrong with grand narratives. I think historians should probably welcome them more than we do. And the only trick is just being able to pivot as seamlessly as humanly possible to be like, for further study, right? Like, here are 78 million books, which have been written about these things. And that's kind of like the balance that needs to be struck, I guess, at the end of the day.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure it won't be the last time that we do this kind of thing. You obviously done things through UCU Commons and other stuff. So
yeah, for sure, anytime.
Thank you so much, Dave.
All right, see you soon, Eric.
See ya. Bye.